Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Fran, and we're going to talk about James, the book of James, as we continue our journey through the general epistles. Now, James is written by the author, James of Jerusalem. We'll talk about James in just a minute and who he is. Written about 62 AD, or sooner than that, or before then. Church traditional accounts indicate that James was told to reject Jesus, taken to a high point of the temple. He didn't do that. He refused to do that, and he was thrown to the ground and finished off with clubs. In other words, he became a martyr for Jesus Christ. He believed what he wrote. And James was considered the brother of Jesus. He was one of Mary's other children. He became a believer after Jesus resurrected and after Jesus ascended, and so he became a leader in the church. His audience that he was writing to was to the 12 tribes scattered, or the diaspora, those who have been scattered across Asia Minor, mainly Turkey. And they were Jewish Christians who believed in Christ but were facing severe persecution because of their belief, as many did. There are some very interesting characteristics of the book of James. One is that it's very prophet-like. James is very blunt. He doesn't hold anything back oftentimes. He tells them things like, "You adulterous people," calls them that. He said, "Do you know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?" And he just tells it like it is. And yet at the same time, he gives them wisdom, and he's wisdom-like. In his approach. He writes, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it'll be given to him." There's a contrast here. Most of all, though, this book is very Jesus-like in its tone. What that means is James sounds a lot like his brother Jesus, and he is speaking to the people here, and in his writing, he is basically saying to do certain things that Jesus said many years ago, 30 years prior, at the Sermon on the Mount. So James chapter 1, verses 22 and 25 sound a lot like Matthew 26 in obeying Jesus' command. "Those who obey me, my commands, will be like a man who builds his house on a rock." James chapter 3 talks about living a life that's fruitful, to produce good fruit. Sounds again similar to what Jesus said in Matthew 7:16. Jesus says, "Don't worry about tomorrow, but live for today." This is what James says, but Jesus says the same thing in Matthew 6. "Don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself." So he's very Jesus-like in his tone, and he's also Jesus-like in his style. His style is very similar in that he gives an illustration for every point he makes. He uses a boat that's drifting in violent seas, right? That's being tossed about by every wave. He talks about a man who looks in a mirror and forgets what he looks like as soon as he turns away from it. He uses bits in a horse that controls where the horse goes to illustrate the tongue. We'll talk about that in fire and boat rudders, talk about the tongue a little bit later on. He talks about Old Testament, and he uses examples of the Old Testament like Elijah praying for rain and other examples. So he uses a lot of style elements that Jesus did when Jesus was on earth teaching. Most of all, though, he's like Jesus in his content. And his content, again, is very, I already mentioned this, but is very much Jesus sounding. He says, "Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves." And what does that mean? Make sure that you're doing what you should be doing. Jesus said, "If you hear these words of mine and you do them, you're like the man who built his house on a rock. So when a storm comes and a rains fall and a wind blows, it will not wash away. But those who hear my words and do not do them will be like the man who built his house on sinking sand. And the storm will come, and the rains will come, and the wind will come, and the house will wash away. Therefore, Be like that wise builder and do what I say and build his house on the solid rock of my teaching and of me. Paraphrase Jesus there, but James is basically saying the same thing. Doers of the word, not hearers only. Don't deceive yourself. Otherwise, you're like that a dumb illustration like this, that anyone who's a hearer of the word and not a doer is like a man who looks intently at his face in a mirror, but when he looks at himself and he goes away and at once he forgets what he was like. Well, that would be ridiculous, right? But the one who looks into the law, into the word, and perseveres, being no hearer but who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Very similar to Jesus in content. I already mentioned that James doesn't hold back and he punches. He gives very direct commands. In 108 verses of his writing here, 50 direct commands. Almost half of what he wrote is a command. Be a doer. If you think you're religious and don't bridle your tongue, it's worthless. Visit orphans and widows in their affliction. Very strong link between what you hear, what you do, and how you're going to practice it and how you're going to live ethically in a world. Here's another example. James 1:19. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. What's he saying to do? Think deeply before you act. Look at what he says, the three things. Quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to get angry, right? And so what's he trying to say here? He's saying very practically, hear what the other brother is saying. Don't quickly interrupt and don't quickly get upset. Boy, that's a good word for today, isn't it? He has some different content that I think we need to explore. And one of them, I think, is probably one of the biggest things that James is known for, and that is faith and works. People get confused on that. They think that James is saying that they should work for their salvation, and that's not at all what he's saying. He's saying faith without works is dead. In other words, if you are a believer in Christ and you're going to do what he does, what he says what he wants you to do. In other words, you're not going to just say I believe and don't do anything with it. Otherwise, that's dead. That's dead. Faith is required, but works is proof of your faith. When you believe in something, you're going to do it. And so he gave examples. Abraham, who was faithful, did great works and did works and even was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, right? His son Isaac, and willing to do that. And so Abraham's life, Abraham's example of works is a proof of his faith. Rahab the prostitute was an example of faith and works. She believed, and when she believed, and it was credited to her as righteousness, when she believed, just like Abraham, when she believed, she proved it by trusting that by hiding the Israelite spies, the Hebrew spies, from the people searching for them in Jericho, that she would have life through them. And she did. And eventually she became in a lineage of Jesus and even of James here. And so faith without works is dead. And yet at the same time, faith must have works that follow. Don't get them backwards. You don't work and then have faith. You have faith and works follow that. James also, content-wise, demonstrates that words matter, that the tongue matters. He uses an example in chapter 3 of how not all of you should be teachers because we're going to be judged with greater strictness. And he said, look, tame your tongue. Every kind of beast and bird, every kind of reptile and sea creature can be tamed. It's been tamed by mankind, but no one can tame a tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. And boy, we know that so well, don't we? And so then he uses some illustrations to say why you should tame your tongue. Very practical advice. He said, the tongue is like a fire. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. Setting on fire the entire course of life and on fire by hell. California with all the wildfires, one little spark can cause incredible damage, right? We know that so well. Horse's bit that moves moves us around, that moves horses around. We put a little bit in the mouth of horses so it'll obey us. We guide their whole bodies as well, and the tongue is like that. Can guide whole great forces of power with the word. The ship's rudder, it can guide the way a ship steers with a word. And he says, look at the ships also. They're large and large winds, strong winds, but yet they're guided by a tiny little rudder. Wherever the pilot directs it, it will go. He said, you can't have blessing and cursing. You can't have fresh water from one mouth, part of the spring, and salt water from the other. So don't speak out of both sides of your mouth. A fig tree can't bear olives, and a grapevine can't produce figs, and a salt pond can't produce fresh water. In other words, if you're going to speak, speak in ways that bless people, not in ways that curse people. Good words. And so James gives some good practical instruction here. On the other content is against prejudice or partiality. He said, you have a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing, and a man in shabby clothing comes in, and you pay attention to one who wears the fine clothing. You sit in a good place, and yet you say to the poor man, you stand over there and sit at my feet. He said, haven't you now made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with the evil thoughts in your heart? And so then he explains to them, he says, if you show partiality, that last verse, you're committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Don't commit partiality. Don't commit sin in that way. He talks a little bit about prayer in chapter 5. He talks about praying for brothers and sisters, praying for those who need to be healed. He talks about praying for those who need to confess their sins. He talked about the faith of Elijah, of who he prayed and rain came. James is a practical book, and it sounds a lot like Jesus and his brother James, not his cousin, as I used to believe. It's truly his brother wrote this in a way that really truly has been helpful for the church. That's Book of James. We'll move on to the next book, the next set of books, right after the end of this. Bye-bye.